Thanks for tuning in to tonight's event, sponsored by the Menard Family George Washington Forum here at Ohio University. Tonight's guest is Elisabeth Lasch-Quinn. She's here to have a conversation with us about the art of living and ancient philosophy. You'll all have a chance to ask Elisabeth questions tonight. Down below, you'll see a Q&A function. Submit your question to that, and I will do my very best to pose all of them to her during the course of our conversation. Elisabeth is professor of history at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs and a senior fellow in the Institute of Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. Her books include Black Neighbors, Race and Limits of Reform in the American Settlement House Movement, 1890 to 1945, which won the Berkshire Prize, and Race Experts, How Racial Etiquette, Sensitivity Training, and New Age Therapy Hijacked the Civil Rights Revolution, which came out in 2001. She's also edited 3 volumes. Her writings have also appeared widely in prominent and scholarly and prominent public venues, including the New Republic and the Hedgehog Review. And her most recent book is one we're going to talk about tonight, on the Fate of Inwardness and the Return of the Ancient Arts of Living. Thanks for joining us tonight, Elisabeth.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So this is a fascinating book, and it's a book about, as I read it, about a diagnosis of our situation, about how some ancient philosophies don't help, and about how one strand really does. So I guess I just want to know, if we just begin, why did you write the book, and what's your diagnosis of the current situation? Nobody says, I love the current moment, let's have more of this, right? So what is it that but we all have different explanations for what we think is wrong. What do you think is wrong?
Well, those are 2 very different questions, why I wrote the book and then what I think is wrong. So shall we launch into what's wrong?
In whatever order you want to take them.
Okay, let's think about that, because that's really the question you ended with. So I do not think everything is wrong. We live in a time of dire crisis, no doubt. And we're all very aware of the nature of these actually multiple crises. However, I saw signs of something so promising when I was writing this book, and this is part of what led me to write it. And that is a return of interest in very deep philosophical standpoints, sometimes religious or spiritual standpoints, very intellectual standpoints. There's all kinds of intellectual ferment in our time. And that actually often does go with a time of crisis. And it's a very promising sign to see people so alive to learning and to thinking at a deep level and to searching spiritually and intellectually. That's indeed what we need desperately, and we've needed it for some time. So I saw these kind of positive stirrings. Then on the other hand, there are all the things that are really terrifying about the time that we're living in. And we wouldn't even have time to list them all, even if we had it in list form and we had the full hour. So I won't go through them all, but I am very concerned with world events, of course, and national events, and the question of, will we still have a nation, little things like that. But besides all that, we have intense personal crises and very troubling trends. Just to sort of gesture to one of those, there are so many, is the suicide rate. Very, very high, and very high among young adults. This should always be a matter of real concern of a society. Certainly that must be some measure of how well a society is doing, to look at its members and ask what is the state of their minds and their selves, and help if the state is not good. And I see us not helping on the whole. Of course, many good people are trying to help in their own ways. But when we stand back from individuals who are trying to help people out in a time of crisis, and we look at the kind of culture that we live in, the messages that we're bombarded with every day, then we look at our problems, substance abuse, self-harm, divisiveness in politics, to the point where people can't even agree on a version of the truth. What is true? That's pretty dire. It's not just people disagreeing about what we should do about different social problems or how we should think about ourselves as a polity, but it's beyond that now. So this is, it's a very scary time to be living in. I wrote the book and put the book to bed, for publication, for, production, before some of these latest crises. So it's kind of going from bad to worse. But because there was this underlying of intellectual ferment, I remain hopeful that we can start to get a grip on ourselves, basically.
Yeah. So you say in the book, you have a line early on, you say that one of the problems of contemporary culture is, and these are your words, right, is its inability, even in the event that basic needs are met, to provide adequate resources for the living of everyday life. What do you mean by that? What are the kinds of resources for everyday life? That's what the book is about. How do we live in just our regular lives? What do you mean by that?
I mean that we are not really acting like a community, or even serving some of the very most basic functions of a community, or even a polity, a society even. We are so split into different warring camps, but also just in terms of sort of an atomistic individualism. The dominant mode, if you have to, spell it out, is basically me first. And it has been for some time. So we're seeing the results of that way of not really even thinking, that way of behaving. So yeah, I think that's at least part of it.
Yeah. Okay. And you talk a lot in the book about the kinds of things that nourish that me first sort of mindset. There is, though, if you go into, when we could go into bookstores, but when you roam around on Amazon or ABE, there are more self-help books than you can swing a dead cat at, right? So how are these self-help books not helping, right? I mean, you're politely and genially excoriating about many things, some of the things maybe we'll talk about later on. But self-help, you don't seem to think that self-help sort of movement or self-help books are actually helping. Why is that in your view?
Well, first of all, may I say that when I criticize self-help, I'm doing it from the point of view of someone who's very well acquainted with it. So I've spent quite a long time in the self-help sections of libraries and bookstores, and I know what it's like to have some kind of thing weighing on you that's so bad that you'll basically take help from wherever you can get it, and you can read you can go to all the sections of the bookstore, and eventually you might actually. And so self-help was, I'm not exempt from looking there for answers. And I would never dismiss all books that end up in the self-help section, but many of them are kind of reductionist. They have a reduced idea of the world and of the human being and of what it takes to address our worst problems. And so even when we don't have our society crumbling around us like this, we as human beings, because of the nature of our lives, we face difficulty and suffering, great, tremendous suffering, even when times are great. So how do we deal with that? If all we have is a self-help section, we're going to find a lot of slogans. we're going to find a lot of lists for different steps you can take. And I'm not referring to AA. I think that's one of the cases where that really is a lifesaver for many people. So it's other lists out there that are not very coherent in that same sense, and they don't have a sense of transcendence the way AA does. That's in many ways, that's going way back to ancient ways of being and thinking about the self, because it definitely thinks about you in relation to other people in your life, as well as, trying to build on your interior self. But many of them do not do that. And they're really more steps for how to get ahead in some way or another, how to deal with troublesome colleagues at work, how to deal with troublesome spouses. And one of the best pieces of advice is always leave. And so, but what's the logic of that? You leave that one, then you have problems, then you go back to self-help section, you leave that and keep going, leave that job, leave that person, leave. It's a lot about leaving. And it's definitely about thinking about the self. And it is self-help. So maybe that we have to say, well, by nature of the beast, but there are definitely good versions in that, of self-help as well. So part of the problem is the section itself. It's full of competing advice. So what does that mean? If you transfer that over to the section on, literature or philosophy or political science, then you have different points of view, but the model there is discussion and debate and disagreement and different points of view. And that's the openness of a liberal and open society, all these different points of view. You can think about it. People present evidence and logic to put their case forward. But in self-help, this is, anyone can become a self-help author who basically can become successful. There's no check on it. So people do write anything and everything, and they advise people to do anything and everything. And I don't think this is helping at all. Much of it is very superficial, and people, I think, are really seriously looking. Maybe they always are, but now that you can tell, people are very seriously looking for deeper answers.
Yeah, you have one of the interesting things about the book is you make clear that no age is not an age of crisis. All people are looking for solutions to problems, and then at least as I read your book, that there are a certain set of perennial human problems to which there have been competing sets of answers, some of which reflect the cultures, right, from which those answers emerge, and that self-help reflects a particular kind of culture in America in maybe the late 20th and early 21st century. As I understand it, maybe you can help me on this. As I understand it, you seem to think that culture, if we want to describe it, would be a therapeutic culture, right? Building on the, you seem to have a lot of time for the Philip Reeve book. So I wonder if you could just tell us, what do you mean by what are the characteristics of the therapeutic culture? And you have another word that you talk about a lot that appears in the book, which is this word emotivism, as a characteristic feature of the therapeutic culture. I just want to make sure that we understand what you think are the kind of characteristics of that before we start talking. Let you talk about some of the ways that ancient philosophy sort of play into that.
The therapeutic culture, the term does come from that classical sociologist Philip Reeve, who wrote a book called The Triumph of the Therapeutic. And it was way back in 1966. And it became a kind of classic in thought. And it influenced people in many different fields. And he described a transition from communities where there is a kind of a shared sense of a commitment, what the higher purpose or what what the community was kind of about, or what they thought was good, what they were dedicated to. There was something shared in terms of what people were sort of striving for. And he thought that this had broken down, and he was seeing the signs of it in the 20th century, but it was there in the 19th as well, the roots of it. And instead, people had lost that sense of a shared common principle or commitment, and were kind of pursuing each his own and her own needs and desires, wants, and kind of to their logical extreme, to the point where there was not much holding people together, and there was the new imperative became letting it all out and sort of showing your inner self in public, displaying your needs and wants. It became sort of taboo to be reserved and to have a private self, and to be thinking, deeply about things before you spoke and things. So that is how he saw it. I try to build on that a little bit. That was the 1960s, and flesh out what I see in the therapeutic culture. And at the same time, this kind of, and I really want to differentiate between therapy that can help individuals, and it can be so good, and it really, to me, it's all up to who is the person providing this, and how coherent is their view, and how well are they working with this person who needs the help. So I'm not trying to condemn everyone who's providing some much needed therapy. It's when the culture becomes about the self and about nothing else. That's really what we see. And when you get deeper into it and you ask, why is this so dangerous? Isn't it just sort of like, oh, people are so selfish. Of course, they've always been, and maybe they're a little bit more now. They think about themselves too much. Yeah. Okay. But if you go deeper into it, what I see is a kind of frightening objectification of the individual. And this is partly because we're now at the height of the advertising, marketing, consumerist society, like we've never seen before, where everything is about buying and selling. And so the self has become almost like an object where many people are looking at themselves from outside of themselves and thinking of themselves that way, defining them by what others see in their imagination, because we don't really know what others see, but what they see looking back at the self. And so this is a kind of scary instrumentalization and objectification of the very self. We've always had criticism of doing that to other people, like using someone to get ahead. I'll get that contact and then my career will take off. That's definitely instrumentalizing people, because you're turning them into an instrument. And that's part of the therapeutic culture. But I think there's even a turning on the self, and turning the self into a kind of instrument to get ahead, but no sense of what getting ahead means, except for pursuing the self's needs and desires. So what troubles me the most about the therapeutic society is that it offers to give the individual well-being, but in fact, it's a culture set up to fail and not to do that. So I think we all do need something that's sort of like a good therapeutic in terms of well-being for the individual. I would like it to extend to the community as well. But so that's not inherently wrong, but the version that we have of the therapeutic. So really, maybe it's better to call it the modern therapeutic or something like that, that one of the most striking traits of it is it's not working,
Yeah. And to go back to your first point, there are lots of evidence on this. There's the great book by Gene Swingy called iGen that has, Gen Z, the highest rates of depression, of suicide, of eating. I mean, every sort of bad thing you can have that can afflict you. Um, the, our youngest generation is facing it in spades in a way that none has before.
Yeah.
All right, so you sort of begin the book by saying, all right, look, there is this therapeutic culture. We all seek. We all know there's a problem. We all live in it. There's this atomization, and then you bring in five different philosophical traditions: ancient Greek and Roman philosophical traditions: Gnosticism, Stoicism, Epicureanism, Cynicism, and Platonism. And um, I just want to just help us understand what you sort of mean by each of these. So you write about Gnosticism. I wonder what it actually is. You have a line where you say Gnosticism is a kind of collective psychosis, and you seem to see Gnosticism as something that almost informs a modern technocratic elite. It's there even if they don't know it. So what is this? What is this thing, Gnosticism? Where does it come from? What is it doing? Why does it matter today?
Okay, that's a great question. And Gnosticism is the stand-alone philosophy. The others are more recognizable as all part of the Greco-Roman philosophical tradition. So Gnosticism does kind of stand apart. And that's in the first chapter where I'm really kind of setting up the book to show what we've been talking about, the therapeutic society. And many social critics have pointed to the modern society, different aspects of it, as Gnostic. So I was just asking, well, if that's the case, is it really Gnostic? And so I was pursuing that to see if that's a helpful way of thinking about the therapeutic society. And I found it was, but I also think that I would love you to keep reading in the book if anyone's going to read this book, even if you don't accept that the modern therapeutic is Gnostic. So that aside, because you might still see aspects of modern life in chapter 1 that you recognize and think about, but maybe think Gnostic is far-fetched. But Gnostic I thought was helpful in capturing a modern sensibility. My short word for Gnosticism, because that's a kind of, esoteric word, it was an ancient Christian heresy, at least many scholars think so. And of course, all this is debated by scholars, the actual historic Gnostic. So that's a separate question. Mine is, what I'm trying to look at is the modern sensibility, the Gnostic sensibility. And the word I think of is knowingness. And Gnostic, really, the word there, knowledge, is right in there. And so, but I'm thinking it's not really knowledge that the modern sort of consumerist therapeutic society is all about. It's this kind of knowingness, and it's kind of shorn of any tie to reality. And so the Gnostics taught many things that overlap with Christianity, and but they completely recast some of those basic elements. And one of them was that they saw the very world, the created world, as evil, not a good thing, not created by a good God, but created by this evil divinity. And the good divinity was way outside, beyond the created world and beyond the creator of the created world, out to this nebulous kind of spiritual principle out there. And only a select group of people had this divine spark within them, and the rest did not. They were considered broken vessels in one of the sources, the ancient sources. And so that they were, they just weren't going to make it anywhere good. But the others had the divine spark in them. They didn't just have access to the divine, they had it in them. So in some way they were divine. And through knowledge, and knowledge was basically of themselves, the knowledge would reunite them with that other divinity way out there, that spiritual one, not the created one. So this this just fit a lot. I mean, it seems like a lot of the modern sensibility fits this. And I'm not talking only about the very wealthy elite thinking that they have inside knowledge. It does fit the technocratic elite, those of that sort of knowledge class that think that they have the answers and that the ordinary, so-called ordinary, there's no such thing, but the ordinary person is hopeless. They have no answers. They have no knowledge. It's almost like that same sensibility of they don't really have the divine spark. They don't, we have the inside knowledge and it's always right. It's right. And a lot of times desire is a big part of it. We desire that to be the right knowledge. And so therefore it is. And then it might not even be fact-based. So, but you have this at all, in all social groups, particularly now. We've seen this take off at groups that are not considered elite in terms of wealth or social class, but they are looking a lot like these kind of modern day Gnostics who believe that they're special, and they're so special that their version of reality is just by definition correct because they're the right people, kind of. And so I search for a term for that. I call it a kind of populist Gnosticism, or it's a kind of an elitism, but of the people who aren't traditional elites, as in the aristocracy or the wealthy, etc. I think this is partly why conspiracy theories have taken off, because it was already fertile ground for this kind of thing. There had been a lot of erosion of commonality, shared communal purpose, shared sense of reality, a lot of hyper-individualism and tribalism already. And so I find that term helps because it kind of refers to a kind of hubris of those people who sort of are the self-appointed divine, and they have the inside knowledge, and other people cannot have access to that social group or that knowledge because just by definition they cannot, because they're the benighted, the ones operating in darkness and illusion. They haven't woken up, in other words.
Yeah, there's I think one of the things maybe to emphasize to the listeners is when you talk about you have a line where you say Gnosticism is expression not of unity but of division, that that there are lots of different Gnostics, right? But the one thing that Gnostics, whatever they may be, the technocratic elite or populists do is they divide the world into two groups: those who have knowingness and those who don't. And so in your telling, there are divisions between different types of Gnostics, right? The world is a battle between, not just between the knowing and the unknowing, but between different kinds of unknowing, and that adds to the kind of cacophony and disaggregatedness of the world in which we live. So there are you identify three ways, ancient sort of philosophies that people have tapped into to one degree or another. Stoicism and Epicureanism and Cynicism really is a way to kind of deal with a therapeutic culture, a world filled with Gnostics. So let's just take them one by one so we understand them, because I suspect some listeners, no offense, might not be up on their latest Marcus Aurelius. So what is Stoicism? I think it's probably the one that people would be most familiar with, even though they didn't know the name. They would have seen it on a coffee mug or something like that. It's in some Marcus Aurelius quote. There are in airport bookstores. We used to go there. Marcus Aurelius for businessmen. What is Stoicism? What does it promise us if we act like Stoics?
So with Gnosticism, we can think about the word knowingness. With Stoicism, I just usually throw out the word gladiator, and many people have seen that movie. A striking number of people have seen it. And those who haven't seen it have heard of it. It's been around for a while, and it's still extremely popular. So it is kind of shorthand in a way, and there is a character even of Marcus Aurelius in there. He was an emperor, Roman emperor, and he was a Stoic author. So we can think of gladiator to try to think about Stoicism, but really maybe self-control is more what they were after. And they are, I think, very misunderstood on the whole. And I guess people can use almost any movement and get very far from what it really was about. And so I think some of the modern Stoicism, the new Stoicism that we see around us is actually dangerous and troubling. Some of it is fantastic, and it's really helping a lot of people. I think of any of these schools of thought, that might be the one that has the most kind of self-conscious attempt to bring a movement back, and it has adherents, and then many websites and many books, and it has academic writers who are recommending Stoicism while they're actually studying these movements, and also it has popular writers, and it has their Stoic Week in England, and that has all kinds. Actually, it has events throughout the world, and there are all kinds of gathering. There's Stoic clubs and things like that. So on the whole, I think it's very promising. It does. You can see effects in the therapeutic, the actual therapy, like AA, and that's very much a Stoic. That's almost straight out of a Stoic text. The saying about, just caring about what you can actually change and do something about, and that helps people very much. And they're great writers on Stoicism throughout time and on into our own time. But what's scary is that some people are taking some of the trappings kind of what they think Stoics were, and they're thinking that, oh, Stoicism means being unemotional, and that must mean being kind of hard and kind of tough. That's all well and good if you're talking about how to weather your own struggles, or if you're like John McCain, who found that very helpful as a POW. He was amazing in his resilience, and he drew a lot of it from Stoicism. And so there's that way of thinking about Stoicism that is very helpful and maybe very overdue in our society to have a comeback, because in many ways it's a corrective of the therapeutic culture. But there's a book called Stoic Warriors by Nancy Sherman, an ethical philosopher, and she has studied Stoicism among modern members of the military. And sometimes it does fit with Stoicism, and sometimes it really gets pretty far from it. And it takes this kind of toughness and makes it into a sort of warrior mentality. And so my assessment of that, when it looks like Stoicism, but strangely enough, it seems to be all about freeing people up to pursue their most aggressive impulses. To me, that's Stoicism getting hijacked by the therapeutic culture.
Yeah, one of the things, for those who will go out and read Professor Lasch-Quinn's book, one of the things that is notable about your book is that, when you come to talk about Stoicism, you say, yeah, controlling your emotions. To what end? Everything is to what end? Why would you do this? What's the purpose of behaving in one way or another? We can sort of get to that. But one of your criticisms about Stoicism seems to be that you say its end is just controlling oneself, right? It's trying to blunt the bad things that come our way in life, but the bad things that come our way in life are actually part of what make us fundamentally human. We're going to suffer and die and experience others, our loved ones, suffering, and that to deny that is actually deny something um, about who we fully are. So I ask a sort of generic question: what is Stoicism? About Stoicism, but um, in your chapter on the new Epicureanism, um, my hard stoical heart went pitter patter when you had a long digression, poleaxing the movie Eat, Pray, Love, and then you followed it up just immediately on its heels. You decided to take a club to foodie culture. Um, hating on Julia Roberts movies and Michelin star restaurants are two things that may be close to my heart. So, how does Eat, Pray, Love, very popular movie, how is this in foodie culture? Getting foamed steak. How is this wrong? How is it part of how does it exemplify Epicureanism? Um, and what is Epicureanism?
Yes. Well, um, I happen to have a whole book about that. So if you really want the answer to every single one of those questions that you asked, it's in the chapter on Epicureanism. But
a follow-up podcast,
yeah. So first of all, number one, I have no gripe with food. Let me be very clear about that. And I have no gripe with food lovers of any kind.
Okay.
And and I really kind of love Eat, Pray, Love. All of the materials I worked with in the book, I partly worked with them because I like so many parts of them, and they're worth looking at. And I think they're worth taking seriously for what philosophy seems to underlie all of these things around us. And you can take this this kind of schema that I'm laying out in the book, and you can look at almost any movie or novel or person that you know, and you can ask, is this kind of a Stoic manifestation or an Epicurean manifestation? So with Epicureanism, their main, if you think of one word for Epicureanism, it would have to be pleasure. They thought that pleasure was the highest end in life. And that might sound simple, and it might sound like a great one to jump on board, because who would not want a whole philosophy aiming at pleasure? It sounds delightful. And then you could have all the food you want, you could have all the drink you want, you could just pursue physical pleasures of all kinds. But those philosophers were very deep, and they always had a theory about everything in life. They didn't just talk only about pleasure and that's it. I gave one sentence: philosophy of life is pleasure, and goodbye. No, it wasn't that kind of self-help. It was a whole philosophy. And so what they were saying is that we can understand the whole universe, where we came from, where we're going, how we should live, by thinking of pleasure as the highest end. So then they would say, well, how can you make sure that your life is devoted to pleasure at all times? Well, there you might have to rein yourself in sometimes, because if today you pursue nothing but pleasure every minute of the day, you might get in so much trouble that tomorrow you can pursue no pleasure. So the ancient Epicureans thought that all out. And they thought, that you should be moderate so that you can continue enjoying life. So Epicurus himself is said, a lot of that is based on legend. We don't know exactly how those early philosophers, did everything, but it's said by many sources that he had a very simple dinner and, supper, and because he was trying to prolong pleasure. He lived in a garden. He surrounded himself with good friends. He liked to have long meals with good conversation. So far be it for me to condemn any of that. But I do think it's limited. I wouldn't stop there myself for philosophy. I don't find that satisfying enough in life. You can draw many good things from that, for sure. And there's a certain truth to it. But in the modern form, and I think we see it in lots of different movies and lots of different places, and again, a lot of self-help, it really is about the individual's pleasure. And it's not a lot about those limits anymore. So it's pretty far from what Epicurus was teaching, but I think it is linked to that. Still, we can recognize the resonance of the early Epicureanism in the modern foodie movement. So, and there are foodie movements and foodie movements, right? So there's some that are about simple living or simple cooking, the buy local movements, all kinds of ways of making sustainable agriculture. So that you could say, well, some of that's Epicurean because it's still about eating and enjoying, pleasure and stuff, but it's about prolonging it because we will have to have a planet in the future if we're going to pursue some of those pleasures. So, but the thing about Eat, Pray, Love, and I don't want to give spoilers if people haven't seen it, but the thing is, it's very near the beginning of the movie. She leaves a marriage and she doesn't really have a very well thought out reason why she's leaving it, and except for that kind of vague thing of the pleasure's not there, so I need to pursue it's the self, the needs and wants of the self. And there's a very sad scene with the husband getting dumped. But then that's just the beginning of the movie, and then there's a whole movie after that.
Trying to come to grips.
You can judge for yourself what you think.
So Stoicism, right, is this, and Neo-Stoicism's attempt it's orienting one's life to avoiding pain, in a sense. And Epicureanism is orienting one's life to trying to rein oneself in every once in a while, but trying to have pleasure. So one is trying to avoid something that is painful for the other. The other is trying to maximize the pleasure. But both you emphasize prioritize the experience, right? So one doesn't want to experience pain. One wants to experience pleasure, and both of these are about me, my experience, my pleasure, not our thing. The chapter on cynicism, you make a point. Look, there is a new Epicurean movement. Stephen Greenblatt will go and write The Swerve. I don't think you're going to be a paid up member of his fan club, but there's a new Stoic movement. There's a new Epicurean movement, and we say there's not really a new cynical movement, but it is, at least as on your telling, it's a kind of attitude that, at least as I read it, is maybe the most pervasive, more so even than Gnosticism. Maybe I misread the book, but it's an attitude about attacking culture, and so you have this discussion of Reese, My Life among the death works, and so I just want to, what do you see? What are the death works, and why does cynicism need to attack culture?
Yeah.
And I think one of the things I wondered is, does it actually attack the therapeutic culture?
Okay. Okay, let me write that down. For cynicism, in some ways, if we have to have one word to sum this up, I hadn't thought of this before, but it might be the word no with an exclamation point. And it's, Diogenes the dog, as he was called, lived out in public, again, legend has it, and in a wine barrel. And he did all of his bodily functions, everything you can possibly imagine, out in public. And he didn't wear any clothes. And so, he was kind of a mess, and he just bared everything. He was right out there. And his theory was, if you can't do it out in public, then is it even good to do? So he was still tied to some sense of morality, but I think in modern cynicism, what often has happened is just the kind of embrace of no without any moral sense. So I think that does help further the therapeutic culture, because it's very therapeutic to yell no and just to force everyone to listen to everything that you say and just bear it all in public, even if it's hate-filled, screeds and rants and private things and movies with intimate scenes that practically take you through the entire act and that are so invasive. And this kind of answer of anti-culture, anti-tradition, the way to get to the truth is just by displaying it all and letting it all out. I think that is so dangerous, and that's partly what we've had a lot of, and that's where we are now. So between the cynicism, the Gnosticism and the cynicism, those two, I think are the dominant ones in our society, at least in our kind of more public culture. I think there are many individuals who are not living according to those, and they are resisting that. And I think that we'll be better off if we hear a lot more from them and a lot less from the sort of dyed-in-the-wool cynics who, they have good motivations often, and they often really are trying to speak truth. And maybe they often reach truth and bring it out into light. So I should say, this book isn't really about trying to say I don't like people who, or movies or anything, novels that have this school of thought. It's really about trying to understand where it was coming from and then look at some of the modern versions and say, are those really even carrying on some of the good things about the ancient versions? Or if they are carrying those on, is it good in the modern context at all? It might not have been good back then, and it might not be good now, but it should be part of the conversation. So, there may be some people who really embrace cynicism and are speaking the truth, and they should be heard. I'm just very worried about the therapeutic culture's hijacking of pretty much any philosophical point of view or religious point of view you want to throw out there that tries to be resistant to it. And I think cynicism can be and has been very much hijacked.
And one of the things that you sort of emphasize in the book is that it, in the same way that Epicureanism and Stoicism are kind of atomizing philosophy, both in its origin and in its modern manifestations. So, okay, you're not throwing Stoics or Neo-Stoics, Epicureans or Neo-Epicureans, or Cynics or Neo-Cynics under the bus. But once we get to the chapter on the New Platonism, you clearly have an affinity for this, and this is part of the argument of the book that Neoplatonists, and they include everybody from the early Camus to MLK to Augustine of Hippo to Plotinus. All of these people, have they have different ideas, different kind of solutions, but they have a sort of orientation towards seeking what you call at some point the beautiful, and this is what you take the art of living. And one of the people in the Q&A says, well, what do you actually mean by the art of living? What are the Ars Vitae, and how does beauty and beautiful fit into that, and how do I even know what something beautiful is? I think that's something I hear sometimes from students. Well, that's just your opinion, man. To borrow the dude from The Big Lebowski, you like Georgian architecture just because you like it. That's just your opinion, man. How would we know what the beautiful is?
Yeah, and that actually goes back to one of the unanswered questions. I realize you asked about emotivism, and that's the idea of that we can decide what's true or real, or matters by what our feeling is. And so that's partly why we're so atomized, because if everyone's doing that, they're just acting on, well, I feel this, I feel that, I feel this, and even to the point where I feel this is true. I feel this person won the election. I feel this, this is how we should go forward. And there's no basis to judge or even to have a conversation, because it's all about emoting, and not how can you even talk about something like what is beautiful if it's all going to be, well, that I just feel it's this, I feel it that it's that. So that the art of living, what do I mean by it? I mean that many approaches to how we live our lives now are not really paying any attention to the idea that living is an art. It's an art form. It's hard to live. Even when things are all going your way, it's still difficult. And then throw in some challenge like the death of a loved one, or some national natural catastrophe. And then it becomes very, very difficult, exponentially more difficult. And so because of that suffering, and even because of good things, good times, we still need a way to live with those things. How do we think about what are the good times? What are the good things? We can't really live in chaos. Psychologically, human beings cannot. We need some kind of structure or order to our minds and to our sentiments, our feelings. And so I think it's an art of living that we're all trying for. And there's no solution. It's not that there's some solution. If we just find the right book, there the answer will be, and now we can go ahead and live our lives. My point is that our whole life is finding the art of living. Every day is finding the art of living, because every day is going to bring something slightly different, or maybe more of the same. And then the art will be, well, how am I going to live with more of the same? So every unfolding moment of a human being's life requires some kind of art of living. And I think that we have a cultural inheritance at this point in our society where it's very hard to find a mode of being that acknowledges that, the difficulty of that, that it is a struggle, but it's also the most incredible blessing. We don't even maybe know how to enjoy to the fullest our lives because we're not seeing it this way. There are other ways that we're often told to see it, and it's so deeply embedded in our culture, it's sometimes hard to see. But one of them is that instead of the art of living, it's the technique of living. So that's partly where the how-to movement, the essence of it is, oh, we just need to find the way to do it. We need the technique. We need the right technique and we need the right process. And then we can go forward. It's the technique of living. It's how to live, really literally like how to live. But I'm talking about changing the way that we think, that it's not about the technique of living. It's about the art of living. What's at the essence of the art of living? What would that mean to think of life as an art and just to dive into it completely? And then that gets to the idea of the beautiful. There are philosophers in my cynicism chapter who think that life is an aesthetic thing. And they're thinking more like my life is creating almost like an object of beauty. Well, that sounds lovely, and more power to anyone who creates an object of beauty. And that's not to be slighted. However, I don't believe that we should be seeing ourselves as objects. And not to see ourselves as objects is to come back from outside, looking at our lives from outside, and to come back in within our bodies and live in the inside and cultivate this inwardness that actually helps you turn outward again and then see the rest of the world from within. So you're not always judging yourself from these externals, which they're pretty impossible for us to do that anyway. We are inside. So it's kind of a re-embodiment. And then in terms of beauty, I draw on Plato and Plotinus, one of the greatest writers, I think, ever, the first great Neoplatonist. He loved Plato. And he just is rhapsodic about the sheer joy of being a human being. I mean, I've read so many things that I've loved, but reading Plotinus was something else. Plato also, it was something else entirely. So if those listening have never had the experience of reading something and becoming elated while you're reading it, then you must keep reading until this happens, because you will find the author and the prose and the language that will do that. And it's like music. It's like a beautiful symphony, if that's the kind of music you like, or an opera. But reading can do that. And Plotinus's language, after a while, you realize he's a philosopher who's really talking about what is beauty, but he's also a poet with prose as you're reading more and more, but even perhaps a spiritual writer, because you realize all parts of you are now engaged in this project of what is beauty. And what Plato and Plotinus contribute that I think is so sorely lacking today is that they always point us to moral goodness. So beauty, there's no way to understand beauty in Plato or Plotinus or the entire Neoplatonic tradition, and that includes Augustine and much of Christian thought, Judeo-Christian thought, and Islam. Many different people throughout the whole world have been influenced by these ideas. And the idea is that beauty is just like what, these old sayings that maybe your mother or your grandmother told you, beauty is as beauty does, or, beauty is in the inside. It's all true. It's true. The real beauty is something else entirely, and it has to do with moral goodness. And we live in a society that has forgotten that and thinks that beauty is something totally different, that is not in any way beautiful if you've ever experienced the real beauty.
Yeah, you distinguish in the book between the good life and the beautiful life. And the good life is this sort of life that is by a set of rules and playbook, and the beautiful life is this sort of Platonistic, Plotinus life. There's and it's a couple questions that have come in. Push this, but there's a tension in that, as you get toward the end of the book. So on the one hand, you say, look, we can't all agree. We just don't. We have a data set. It's called human history. We don't all agree on what is the good. And yet, right, as you just said, then you have a great line. You said, with no vision of the good, we are lost and bereft. All our projects become self-serving, yet serving our own ends for the sake of serving our own ends can never serve our ends. So, on the one hand, we can't agree about what the good is. On the other hand, we have to search for the good. And if we don't, we get the kind of mess in which we currently live. So then the challenge seems to me that your book raises is, we live in a world in which that's hyper pluralistic, that's divided, that is, one of the questioners pointed out, like, hey, is part of this just development of development of capitalism? Some of the things that you talk about, consumer culture stuff. We live in the kind of world in which we live, in which that's hyper pluralistic, that's capitalistic, and we have to on Elisabeth Lasch-Quinn's reading, we can have no inwardness. We can't have a beautiful life unless we don't have a vision of the good. So how do those two tastes? How do you do the Reese's peanut butter cup and make these two great tastes go together? Hyper pluralism, and we need to search for the good, that we can't agree on the good.
Yeah, and that is a great image, that there's nothing like chocolate and peanut butter. So, you can't beat that.
No.
So, and look, we're agreeing on that.
Yeah, that's the good.
Beautiful
there it is.
combination.
Foodies,
Okay, so you're saying that on the one hand, we don't all agree. We live in a hyper pluralistic world. And on the other hand, we need a vision of the good. And you're telling me that those don't go together?
Well, I'm just saying it's hard to manage.
It is hard to manage. Yes.
And what is, I mean, people listening to this will go, I can imagine that the people listening to this will go, Professor Lasch-Quinn, this is all very good. You've given us these, recondite things. How the hell am I supposed to put this into action?
Yeah.
And how are we supposed to put it into action? How am I supposed to?
Yeah, I love the question, and they should be asked. People should ask until I give a satisfying answer, or they read the book. Yeah. But which is a much more intricately worked out answer to that question.
It is.
So first of all, who says we need to agree? The disagreement that we see out there that's tearing us all apart is not disagreement that can exist among, compatriots or family members who love each other, or friends, or members of the same church or community, neighborhood, and world. We can disagree. We do disagree. Think of people that you disagree with and you still have bonds with. And in fact, through disagreeing, the bonds have become richer and deeper, and you know each other much better, and you trust people more. The other kind of disagreement that we have, that is disagreement, but it's real division, and it's stubbornness, and it's self-righteous in not a good way, not like righteous anger because it's moral and it's very informed and it's tied with goodness. It's really a kind of a tribalism, and other people have written great books about that it's kind of almost like a group psychology that's going on right now, where people are so dug in based on that feeling of wrong and another wrong and then another wrong, and it's going back and forth to the point where it doesn't even make sense anymore. I'm talking about pulling out of all that, if you're a part of that. And inwardness is where you go when you try to pull out of the nonsense or everything else is falling apart around you, to go deep within and to find the inner resources to resist. Eric Voegelin talked about not being part of the spiritual illnesses of your age. And he thought that Gnosticism, modern Gnosticism, was the spiritual illness of our age. And he said that it's often very hard, and you feel like you're only one person or just a small group, but it's refusing to go along with what's really ill and wrong around us. And if we, really contemplate the world that we see, we can, reach an understanding of what's wrong. And it would be a sense that you could get many people to agree with too, if they did the same thing, that it's not right to, storm the Capitol. It's just not right to loot and tear down buildings. It's not right to kill. It's not, shootings are wrong. I mean, there's a lot that we could agree on that, but then there's this other kind of rich disagreement over what is the good, what is the beautiful. And what I'm saying is that we're not having those conversations. we're just having the ones about disagreeing on a more superficial level of kind of symptomatic that your worldview must be wrong. I'm not really sure why, but I really don't like it. But not listening to what is the other view. Is there any commonality? There are ways to have rich disagreements that don't tear everything down, but they actually build everything up. And that is what this country was trying to be. And, that's what democracy is always trying to be. So when I say we need a vision of the good, I'm saying that we need to believe there is something such as the good. And then the rest of our lives are what we do with our lives is finding that out and discussing that and thinking about that. What is the good in every situation? And instead, what we often have is say a problem comes up and we want a solution. We want a technique to throw at that problem. We want that problem to go away. And we just want a way to deal with that problem. And that's where you can have a real split and people digging in. I don't like that way. I don't like governmental spending. That makes government big and then freedom is gone, et cetera, et cetera. And on the other hand, we need, very big government to help out people. They're suffering. We need to help with social welfare. And so not talking about why we think what we think or using evidence or patience and then perhaps getting to a conversation about, well, what is the good? Is there anything we share that we believe is the good? And could we work from there? It's not saying, I'm not trying to say that there is this magical vision of the good and the beautiful that already exists before any of us, but rather that it's something we reach after all the time. And we do it with each unfolding moment because something new happens each minute and each day and each month. And so then we have to ask ourselves again, where is the good? What is the beautiful, as in moral goodness? And it's basically finding our ideals and keeping our ideals alive. And even if that only means that we keep the idea that we have ideals alive, that's enough, because then we have those other kinds of conversations about what is right to do, what is good to do. So if we were doing town planning and we decided, okay, we're going to structure this town, we're going to have a road going right through it, a highway right through it, no town green, etc. Or we say, wait, what's the good here? What's the morally good thing? What's the beautiful thing? What's good for the community? What's good for us as individuals? Will our well-being really be served here, or will it be a temporary feeling of the therapeutic, a satisfaction, but then it's gone, and actually now we're dissolving our whole society. So we could have that every time we build a building, every time we shop for a meal, every time we structure a social policy, every time we decide what classes to offer, how to build a university, how to teach children, how to structure the workplace, how to structure the economy. Every single thing that we all do, and everyone does a different part of this. If we were always asking, what are the ends that would be served, not just how to solve this problem, I don't think solutions, they're often short-sighted. And I don't think that's the only way to think, that, oh, we need a solution to make this all go away. And then especially with our lives, we don't need a solution to our lives. Our whole life is the solution. We're lucky to keep living. And each moment that we have to live, we get to keep thinking about that. And we don't need to solve that. We just need to live our lives and enable other people to live theirs.
So that's right. So that comes for those who are listening. There's a lot about architecture that's interesting in the book, and the stuff on your stuff on architecture. Some of the most fun, some of the fun bits, and I'll send send people to YouTube, the internet looking up the stuff. But so that's a disposition you need to have. But as you know, right, as the first, I don't know, 2/3 of the book suggests, you don't ask those questions if you think like a Stoic, a Cynic, an Epicurean, or a Gnostic, right? And so I think this is one of the things in reading the book. You know, these questions are that searching for the good is the thing, and is the thing, maybe we even know sort of intuitively, this is the thing that brings deep happiness. But to do that requires overcoming the entirety of the culture, at least as you described it, and that seems like a lonely task, right? Maybe not as lonely as being in the a sort of atomized member of the therapeutic culture, but nonetheless a lonely task. There's a question, speaking of groups, in which someone said, organized religion is on the decline in America. How do modern religious movements interact with these ancient philosophies, if at all? And maybe one of the things I said is what you're really looking for, advocating for, redemption and salvation, and can Platonism do that? In other words, is what you want, redemption and salvation. And as this questioner would do, is that can't be achieved through Platonism. It can only be achieved maybe through something that is transcendent, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, something like this, some sort of religion. I wondered the religion and the good question for you.
Well, I don't think that any one of these philosophies, even my beloved Platonism, is the answer to everything. I think that's the opposite of what philosophy gives us. It's philosophy is the love of knowledge, the love of wisdom, and I think it was Vogelin who really emphasized that sophos means knowing, and that can only be God. And then we are merely able to be philosophers, and that is people who love knowledge and love wisdom, whatever knowledge or wisdom that we're going to be able to have in our limited capacity as mere mortals. And so there's a really humbling aspect to philosophy as a way of life, as a guide to thinking about our quandaries and our aspirations. And I think when I talk about philosophy, I'm talking about something every single person has and has access to, that I think everything that we do and think has an implicit philosophy to it. If we look deeply enough, it speaks to a worldview. And I would like us to think more about what kind of worldview does it speak to, different things that we do in our lives. So I'm not at all trying to prescribe anything in this book. I'm trying to inquire and seek and ask questions and be a fellow traveler with all of you who are on this call, who are clearly thinking about some aspects of this yourself. I think that what I would really like is the conversation to come back. I'm uncomfortable with just the new Stoicism, and then that's kind of a solution and answer, or the new Epicureanism, et cetera, the new Cynicism. I think we need the rich conversation. It's a conversation about how should we be living, and to what ends, and it does talk about how as well, the how and then what for. And if we hear from people who have gone inward and thought deeply about what philosophical assumptions are they working from, and what ideals do they have that they're aspiring toward, that's going to be a whole different set of conversations. And that's what I think we need, is conversation. Now, the religious question about whether am I talking about redemption and salvation, I would have to say absolutely. I think human beings are very interested in redemption and salvation. And we can't really even understand the Christian tradition without understanding these schools of thought. They were so involved in everything. All of the theologians would have, you can even, look at them that way. Is this theologian kind of a little more stoic, as in Niebuhr or someone like that, a little more Epicurean, as we see in a lot of the rituals and the sensual, the sensuous aspects of various different religious traditions. You can see the Platonism clearly. And I would argue that Platonism did have a robust concept of transcendence. I don't think that all other later renderings of transcendence automatically is traced back to Plato. That would be silly. There are many different traditions. But yes, those questions are key to me. I didn't, that's not really where I was going. Well, actually, it was where I was going, but I don't want to give spoilers in the book. But there is a certain amount about that as you go on in the book. Yeah, that's a great question. I think we crave and we need resources for.
So we have people who want to get involved in conversation. People who watch this, who watch on YouTube afterwards. What are 3 books? You say, all right, you talk about practical philosophy. Give listeners, who may not be professional philosophers, present company included, what are 3 books they should read, or that they could read, that would be get them thinking in a Lasch-Quinnian way? The questions, not the answers.
Number 1, did you hear about Ars Vitae?
I heard it's a great book, and everyone who's coming tonight will get an email from me with a discount code.
I had to say that because I just think it's so beautiful. I think Notre Dame just did such a beautiful job with it as a physical object, and I have the illustrations there. That is too impossible. Look behind you. You have all those books, as long as it's not one of those fake screens.
No, it's not a fake screen. No.
And then look over here, and then out of the picture, you'll see all of Kierkegaard's work. So how am I supposed to choose here?
Okay.
So 3 authors, I would say Plato, Plotinus, and Augustine, because don't deprive yourselves. I deprived myself until later in life. I mean, partly this book comes out of a whole new education that I had after I was a professor for 15 years and a modernist, really. But I brought back all of these other interests in languages and antiquity and philosophy, ancient philosophy, and kind of put it all together with modern culture. And it's partly because I read Plato, Plotinus, and Augustine. If you don't read Augustine's Confessions, I cry a tear for you.
It's one of the great books.
It's going to change your life no matter what age you are, or no matter how much of it you read. Just read a little bit, because any part of it, a taste of it, is so delicious. And then Plato and Plotinus, you don't have to read all of them. They're very hard, I understand. And today there's so much competing for our attention. But what about just reading one little part of, maybe I would have you read Plato's Symposium. Just read the episode with Diotima talking about the ladder of love. I just feel like, how can we live without knowing about the ladder of love? And so little gems like that. And then Plotinus, if you read they were called Enneads, his basically little essays, and the one on beauty. Must read. But I love many modern authors as well. So if you're really not interested in those ancient texts, although there's great translations, so just if one of them seems this is not working for me, keep going, because different people translate these texts very differently, and there's good versions and some very stilted or inaccurate to the poetry of it, aspects.
Well,
But
Plato, Plotinus,
yeah.
and Augustine. That's a
Yeah,
that's
but
a
there's a lot of
fine
modern authors.
that's a
Yeah,
fine Mount Rushmore,
yeah,
and a modern author, Elisabeth Lasch-Quinn. Thanks
yeah.
for
But
having.
also, do not miss Tolstoy, because if you don't read Anna Karenina again,
Yeah, yeah,
that's one book that has answers to almost everything in life. But there's a lot of other good things too.
yeah. Well,
Basically, read
yeah,
until you are elated.
read old books. So
Yeah,
thanks much for having joined us tonight, Elisabeth.
you're so
If those of you who've tuned in like what you hear, the next Menard Family George Washington Forum event will be on the 14th of April, when Eric Nelson of Harvard University will come talk to us about the theology of liberalism. In the meantime, thank you, Professor Quinn, and to all of you.
Thank you all. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.